So we took a look at the sources, and then in the previous video we took a look at the destinations. I left the transformations for the last of our overviews simply because there are more transformations than there are both sources and destinations. Just a lot of them to look at. So I'm going to split this just quick overview into two videos. Part one, we'll look at half of them. Part two, we'll look at the other half. We're progressing quite nicely. Still have a ways to go here with the transformations because we need to actually see some of them in action. This video and the next one, they're just overviews trying to say, hey, here are all the different transformations. After we get through lecture mode here, then we'll get into actually seeing them in action. Okay, so I've got them listed. This is a default installation of SSIS 2008. Yours may be different depending if you've purchased additional transforms, installed a service pack or something later that adds them in. Right now, as of 2009, early 2010, this is set. This is what you get out of the box, straight with the developer edition, at least the developer edition of SSIS 2008. So I'm going to walk through every single one of them, explain what each one of them does. However, the way they're listed in the little tab group over there under data flow transformations, you know, when you're in SSIS and it says data flow transformations, they are by default sorted alphabetically. And I don't know about you, but I can't take a list of, I don't know how many things that is. You know, here's 5, 10, 15, 20, 20. Let's call it 30-ish. So I can't take a list of 30-ish things and just remember them. I've got to group them into smaller subsets. And you can easily do that with the transformations here. In fact, Microsoft groups them in the documentation according to these 5 little subsets here. BI, business intelligence, row set, split and join, and auditing. Okay? So let's just walk through. Tell you what we'll do is we'll cover the business intelligence and the row in this video. We'll cover row set, split and join, and auditing in the next video. Fair enough? Let's go. So business intelligence transforms here. Now, I am going to try something new for this video, something I haven't tried. One of the things I liked about, a decade ago, being in a live classroom prior to really having the sufficiently advanced technology to show fancy PowerPoints and do all the drawings on the screens, was if you had one of those overhead projectors, some of you guys may not even know what I'm talking about, but some of you may be familiar. We used to have these overhead projectors, and you'd place a little transparent slide, you'd put it on the base of the overhead, and it would project it onto the screen. And if you wanted to kind of step down a slide, you'd simply place an opaque piece of paper, and that way the light couldn't shine through it, and then you'd move that piece of paper down until you got to the points that you were on slide. You know how in PowerPoint we can just show part of a screen at one time and then we hit a button and the next part flies in or blinds in or appears or whatever? Well, that works great except for when working with tables like this. So with tabular data, you cannot, in PowerPoint, step through each row in the table. You either make the whole table appear or you don't. And I use PowerPoint to do my slides. So I'm going to try something here that I downloaded off of the internet here. It's called Screen Concealer. So you and I will kind of both see if it works. And it's essentially an overlay that I can move down the screen so that you only see part of it. It's a little bit hokey, if that makes somehow, I don't know, that probably doesn't make any sense. It's a little bit low tech. It's just putting a black box over it. But I think for the time being that it will serve our purpose of walking down the table so that we can isolate the individual elements of a table. I had the choice of printing this a different way, but just personally, I learn better when data is arranged in tables. So for the printed PDF version of this, I wanted it to be tables. It just didn't work so well in the flow of the video, and so I just have this little concealer here, little thing here. All right, so let's go, and we're going to talk about each of those 5 groups. So we're going to start with the first group called Business Intelligence Transformations. Now, what these are is this is your common business intelligence requirements, your data scrubbing, your cleansing the data mining related tasks, for example. And I have mine just over here on the left side in the table sorted alphabetically. So let's just talk about the data mining query. You see over on the right hand side where it says SSAS, right? This is analysis services only. SQL Server Analysis Services, probably know that already, just making sure. But this will allow you to perform prediction queries against the mining models. So this is for those of you who are interested in SSIS. The fuzzy grouping transformation, we need to understand this idea of the word fuzzy because there's a couple of these. So fuzzy is often used when you're talking particularly about string data in technology. Let's take 2 words and let's see if they're kind of similar. So, the equality symbol would say whether 2 terms are equal. But what it would not tell you is whether those 2 terms were extremely similar, like the word tree and trees. Tree and trees are not the same word. They're not identical, but they're very, very much alike. And so a fuzzy grouping allows us to say, hey, I want to count the number of words. I want to group the rows together based on how similar the terms are related to each other. Okay, so a fuzzy grouping, what this is going to do is it's going to group the rows together so that it returns a definitive row. There might be, let's see, 100 rows in the input source. And of those 100, they either have the word tree or trees with capital, some with capital T's, some without capital T's, some all uppercase, some all lowercase. But when the fuzzy grouping is applied, we can specify that we want a single term to be chosen, and all of those groups get simply dumbed down to one definitive canonical row. So the fuzzy grouping allows us to do we have a lot of choice on how the fuzziness is done. We'll talk about fuzziness in a little bit later. We'll do some demos related to that. It does require you use a SQL server so that it can use the tempdb for some sorting. Let's move down here. Let's take a look next at the fuzzy lookup. I have on here that this is an alternative to the lookup transform. However, it's not until the next video we actually talk about the lookup transform. So for the time being, just understand that it allows you to have lookup tables, and you can look up values in another data source, and so that you could stream one final result that comes from 2 different data sources. And it uses fuzzy logic to do the matching instead of equality or greater than or less than, for example. Again, if that doesn't make too much sense, kind of wait until we get into the next video and we talk about lookups. The slowly changing dimension. This is again for those of you running SSAS, and if you want to slowly load your dimensions based on simply the changes since the last time you loaded your dimensions, you would use the slowly changing dimension. Term extraction here, this is a nice one here. This, you pass in you have the specific data types, some type of a Unicode string or Unicode text data source, and it will actually go through and it breaks it down, and it will show you either the noun or noun-based phrases, and then it gives a score. And that score could either be the number of occurrences of that noun in the data source, or it could be based on an actual scoring mechanism within the term extraction transformation. So you could use this to build lists of words that are found within descriptions. You could load up blog comments to find out how many times a particular phrase or product or term was mentioned in those comments. Very good for doing that type of thing. I think we're down to our last one here. I can't see any more than you can when it comes to that black blocking screen there. And so we get the term lookup. This is a combination of the lookup transform and term extraction so that it uses the term extraction to extract the term and then performs a lookup based on that term. Again, more on lookups when we get into the next video. Okay. So let's take a look at the next one, and I shouldn't have done that. I'm still getting used to this piece of software here. Sorry about that. Let's talk about the other one that we said we would do in this video, the row transformations. So we did the BI transformations last one. Row transformations create new columns, and whatever transformations that are applied are done to each input row and then sent to the output. So creates a new column. So the first one, the character map. This is actually a very common one. Uppercase, anytime you want to convert to uppercase in the output. So you just drag in a character map transformation and it does that for you. You can do katana, all kinds of different Chinese things that I've never needed to do, don't necessarily need to know. Japanese language things, changing the width, changing the casing. You'll probably find many uses of the character map, particularly if you need to move from a situation where your data was all uppercase. Copy column. This is probably not going to be used all too often, but it's handy to know about. This simply makes a copy of one of the input columns, and now you have two output columns that have the same thing. Now that may not seem too interesting, but later on in your data flow, you may choose to use a character map on one of the columns. So you might have the original column and then you might have an uppercase, a character map of the same column so that you can do later on some other transformations to it. So usually if you do that, it's because you plan on using that later in the data flow, but still want to preserve the original. Down. Data conversion we've covered quite extensively so far. It's just simply changing the data types, changing it from a Unicode string to a non-Unicode string, from a 4-byte signed integer to a 1-byte signed integer, and having to do that so that you don't get validation warnings or type conversion errors. I use the derived column quite frequently. This is when you take the values of an input and you go ahead and you make a separate column in the output based on some type of either concatenation, arithmetic, an expression, a variable, whatever it may be. Very common, easy example for people to understand. Let's say that in the input you had 3 columns: first name, middle initial, and last name. Well, in the output, you can actually make a derived column called full name that would do concatenation of first name, middle name, and last name. So that in the end, you really only have to export or import, depending on what it may be, that full name column. It is derived based on the values of other columns or functions or expressions or variables in the SSIS package. The export column, well, I can show you the import column as well because it's kind of the opposite here. The export column, you have a column in your database that stores binary data. And for this example, I just chose the MP3 example. So at some point, a developer, a program has stored MP3 files in your database, for example, and converted them to binary format prior to doing so. Now you want to export those values back out to MP3 files. You would use the export column. So it creates a file based on the parameters you provide it. The import column is how you would actually load those files into binary form in the SQL Server. That's how you would handle that. So it's just the opposite of the export column. Last one here in the row transformations is that for each row in the input, you are allowed to issue an OLAD command, OLADB command rather, which is really a SQL statement that gets executed. So you are able to access the input rows values so that you could run stored procedures, do delete statements, update statements, all within the data flow. Okay, so we can go ahead and close our little friend there, the concealer here. And I tell you what we'll do in the next video. Let's come back and talk about the rest of the transformations.